In 1928, the great Croatian sculptor Ivan Mestrovic was commissioned by the Art Institute right here in Chicago under the auspices of the Ferguson Fund to design and sculpt a piece of art that would, in the words of the fund's initial endowment, memorialize events in American history. Created in 1905 by the Chicago lumber tycoon and subsequent philanthropist Benjamin Franklin Ferguson, and equating to somewhere between $20 and $30 million in today's currency, the fund is responsible, I think, for some of Chicago's most remarkable, iconic, but also most important public monuments. In that vein, then, Ivan Mestrovic was called upon to create a piece of public history. And that he most certainly did, ladies and gentlemen. His two separate sculptures, the Bowman and the Spearman, and known collectively as the Indians, which now stand in Grant Park and which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, were the result of his rather impressive labours. Mestrovic's designs depict two images of great vitality and physical predominance. Both are equestrian statues, the mounted riders poised to loose their respective weapons. In many ways, they are the inverse mirror images of each other, very much active in their movements. In fact, if you see these statues, you will feel that they are almost leaping off of their pedestal. The bowman with left arm outstretched, his right drawing on the string of his bow. The spearman, left elbow in fact crooked, right arm extended and ready to strike. They are the prime examples of the creation of a masterful creation, I would say, of a true genius at work. Mestrovic was recognised in his own lifetime, in fact, as possibly the greatest living sculptor. And some commentators went as far as to suggest that he was, in fact, the greatest sculptor of religious forms since the Renaissance. He went on to hold professorships here in the US at Syracuse University in New York, and later, I'm sure Terry will be happy to hear this, at Notre Dame. And in 1954, the then serving president, Dwight D. Eisenhower, personally presided over the ceremony that granted Ivan Mestrovic his American citizenship. Now, why begin a presentation like this one, in which we are going to commemorate and remember, and in some cases analyse Fort Dearborn and the events of 1812 with reference to Ivan Mestrovic? Well, in trying to engage with, I think, some of the key elements in that process of commemoration, by examining the ideas of history and memory in the city of Chicago, it is important for us, I think, to recognise how Chicago as a city remembers and represents its past. Sculptures, monuments, works of art often act as memorials to great people or great events in history and signify what we as a community have decided to commemorate. What we decide to sculpt, to build, to paint even, in a historical context, is key to shaping our collective memory, be it as visitors or indeed as residents of a great city such as this. Secondly then, I think it is very, very important, particularly when we are discussing how we remember events in our history that are disputed or indeed contested, and much like those that we will concentrate on today, that we move beyond the very narrow understanding that our own respective histories are in some way distinct or just completely different from those of other people or other places. Our history is certainly shaped to reflect events and happenings that are specific to our own experiences. But while those events may differ almost everywhere, the process of writing history, in documenting the past, and in turn disseminating that information to a wider audience, faces many of the same challenges and confronts many of the same obstacles almost everywhere. National exceptionalism, this idea that in some way our history, your history, their history, is just simply different, is something that I think most historians at least would now see as folly. This is true of Europe, as it is of the United States, as it is of almost anywhere, in fact. And the way we can tackle the disputed elements of our history, those disputed portions of our history, like those events at Fort Dearborn in August 1812, is to compare them to the history of other people and other places, to create, if you will, almost comparative histories or even transnational histories. Now, if you haven't already guessed, and if Terry's fine introduction, or at least my accent, hasn't given it away, I am, of course, a native and citizen of Ireland and an Irish historian. On our island, we have had a long and difficult past in trying to find what might be called the middle ground, in an interpretation of a history that is, I think, acceptable to everyone on the island of Ireland. It is a history that has fundamental divisions at its very core, and often finds it hard to, I suppose, recognise the role of all the people on that island, of all political persuasions, nationalities, or creeds. For example, at Trinity College in Dublin, Professor Jane Omar spearheaded a project known as the 1641 Depositions that sought to analyse and in many respects reassess a key moment in Irish history, namely the 1641 rebellion, in which, very generally speaking, a Catholic minority and revolt against the ruling Protestant elite cost the lives of countless people. Like the history of Fort Dearborn then, and to a greater extent Chicago, this event divided contemporaries and historians alike. Coming to terms with these kinds of episodes in our respective history, as Professor Omar has stated in the past, is one of the biggest challenges faced not just by historians, but also by individuals and communities. And we must, I think, also remember that what happened in Chicago in August 1812 was, in many respects, the final act in the history of what we might call the old Fort Dearborn. It was, in a sense, an end, not a beginning, to a story that had begun in 1803 when the first US surveyors, under the command of Captain John Whistler, an Ulster-born Irish-American, and in fact grandfather of the great American painter and artist James McNeill Whistler, who would go on to create Whistler's mother, arrived at a place right on the shores of Lake Michigan and established there in 1803 one of the westernmost outposts of the United States. Today's Whistler's original site is situated at the centre of the city, in an area that is, it could be said, I think, at the very heart of this city, at the raised intersection of Michigan Avenue and Wacker Drive. Just as in 1803 then, Fort Dearborn is very much a point of intersection, a meeting place, a place of coming together, and I think now it must, in maybe a metaphorical sense, fulfill that role in the creation of a common cultural memory for all of the residents of Chicago. Now, just before I hand over to Kyle Johnson, who is going to really set the tone for our cruise and is going to give us a couple of pointers and a couple of notes on the events at Fort Dearborn in August 1812, I want to just very quickly take the opportunity, as we're parked here and stopped off the shore, to note and thank some of the people who helped in putting together this whole event. And whose work greatly influenced this presentation. Firstly, I want to thank Professor Jane Omar, who, in her role as Vice Provost for Global Relations at Trinity, really helped in setting all this up, as well as her work that I've already referenced at the start of this presentation. I want to thank as well Jerry Crimmins, who I know wanted to be here today but was unable to attend. Jerry has produced a historical novel that some of you might be aware of on Fort Dearborn. And I think it's fair to say that the research for that novel would put many professional historians to shame. But he was really very willing to discuss with me in the lead up to this presentation all of that research, along with his own opinions and the various competing interests about these events right here in Chicago on the ground. And that was invaluable to me. Of further note, I must extend really a great recognition of thanks and to Professor Anne Durkin Keating, who, through her exceptional kindness, allowed me to see some of the manuscript versions of her work rising up from Indian country, which I know has now been published by Chicago University Press. Professor Durkin Keating teaches right here in Illinois at North Central College. I think her work now in Rising Up from Indian Country is the first by a modern historian, at least, and I would say now probably the best by any historian, purely historical account of the early beginnings of Chicago, and specifically the events at Fort Dearborn. Similarly, I want to thank Kyle Johnson, who is another budding historian, and from whom you're about to hear. Kyle acted in many respects as a research assistant on this project. And I hope that we might see Kyle at Trinity College in Dublin in the future. If his work is anything to go by, at least on this project, I think he has a stellar career as a historian ahead of him. So I want to extend a really deep, meaningful thanks to Kyle. Terry has today given us an opportunity to rethink and reassess the history of Chicago at this key moment on the cusp of the bicentenary of those events in 1812. There is only so much that lecturers or teachers can do in the lecture hall or the classroom to encourage and to indeed disseminate the study of history. However, it is with events like this and through his own personal love and enthusiasm for the subject, and I hope you won't mind me saying, but his love for this great city too and his wish to share that with others, that Terry has brought this debate at this crucial moment to a much wider audience. I thank him for that personally, and for giving me the opportunity and the great pleasure that comes with that for being here today. But I want to hand over to Kyle, who's going to say a couple of words now that we are parked off the shore here and in a place that is almost key to the events at Fort Dearborn in August 1812. And I think Kyle has a couple of words to say just at this moment.
Alright, good morning. As Sean mentioned, I'm Kyle Johnson. About 100 yards due west from here was the actual spot of the Fort Dearborn massacre. I would like to specifically pay tribute to the soldiers and warriors who gave their lives during the conflict, but also to the victims and the witnesses of the events that took place here 200 years ago. I would like to start by quoting from a respected Chicago historian named Jean Hunt. She wrote about this event before anyone ever considered that this was anything other than just a massacre. But even in her factual detail of the account, we see that this was a more complex issue than was originally thought. The facts which she so expertly conveyed show that from even the perspective of those who had a vested interest in protecting the memory of the Fort Dearborn as a symbol of Americans' right to manifest destiny, these events were very difficult to categorize. Ms. Hunt talks about the evacuation of the fort and talks specifically about the conflict of that day, August 15th, 1812. At 9 a.m., the evacuation began. Leading the way out of the fort was William Wells and about half of the Miami warriors who was accompanying him. Next in the line of march were 54 officers and men. Captain Held and his wife Rebecca were both on horseback. Then came 2 wagons full of the women and children of the men and the officers and settlers of the fort. 12 local men, the Chicago militia, marched behind the wagons, and last were the rest of the Miami warriors. The group marched about 2.5 miles along the edge of the Lake Michigan, up to about 18th Street, where the Potawatomi attack began. Seán will tell us about the furious fight that happened here that caused bloody deaths on both sides from all races, genders, and ages. Hunt discusses the special relationships, affiliations, and friendships between the warring parties. Many of these relationships were formed due to the fact that several of the settlers were multicultural and multiracial. John Kinsey, the man who ran the trading post, was considered a neutral observer and was not harmed during the fighting. The Potawatomi chief, Black Partridge, saved Kinsey's stepdaughter from the slaughter by pretending to drown her in Lake Michigan. Yet, in the bigger picture, there was excessive bloodshed on both sides. Hunt tells us that 43 of the original 100 of the evacuation group survived the initial attack here. Yet survival did not necessarily mean freedom. Captivity followed for most of the settlers. At this time, I welcome you in remembering all those in this conflict. In particular, I would like to remember those who lost their lives. The women, the children, a slave and her infant son, the U.S. soldiers, and the Potawatomi warriors. Now, in August of 2012, we are going to ring the ship bell, the Fort Dearborn's bell, 12 times to commemorate all those involved in the Fort Dearborn conflict of August of 1812.
Kyle's excellent summation of these events that happened almost exactly on the spot of the shore where we are cruising, rather perfectly give us a much better understanding, not just of those events 200 years ago, but also demonstrate the complexity in commemorating and addressing those events. Yet again, Ivan Mestrovic, in fact, acts as a great case study in helping us find a way of looking beyond that history and looking beyond our own past and our own borders. In 1927, for example, he had entered a competition to design the first coins of the Irish Free State. After a bloody period of revolution and subsequent civil war, Ireland had gained limited independence from British rule in 1922. Like all new nations, the United States being a prime example in the 1770s and 1780s, Ireland was no different, in fact, in creating its own recognisable symbols of independence and sovereignty. Symbols that would represent not just the country's past, but also look to its future, a flag, a national anthem, and of course, its own coinage. Unfortunately, the following year, due to some serious communication problems, Mestrovic was not contactable and his designs were not used. Where was Ivan Mestrovic in 1928? Right here in Chicago, laying the groundstones for his final works on the bowmen and spearmen that now adorn Grant Park in Chicago. I think this is one of those very pleasing coincidences of history, and while Mestrovic was industriously chipping away and laying those groundstones for his monuments, poor Ireland was left to find some other lesser work to adorn her new coins. William Butler Yeats, our greatest poet and Nobel Prize winner, who acted as chairman of the design committee, believed Mestrovic's work to be simply magnificent. But not to worry, Mestrovic, after hearing that his designs could not be used, gifted his work to the Irish people, and they have acted and been the seal of the Central Bank of Ireland for almost 50 years. So I think at this juncture, it's quite apt for me to say, on behalf of the people of Ireland to the people of Chicago, no hard feelings. But this is just one of the numbers of, I think, sometimes abstract connections between Ireland, Chicago, and the United States as a whole. And it is most pleasing, I think, to reminisce on. But it is nonetheless a very telling narrative. One that signifies how the history of different places and different peoples can, in many ways, face the same challenges, follow similar themes, and ask many comparable questions. With his work in both instances, Ivan Mestrovic was directly influencing public memory and perceptions of history. His work symbolises the inescapable cultural heritage of both places, be it in his bowmen and spearmen here in Chicago, or in the continued use of his designs in Ireland. To paraphrase Professor Jay Winter, who is Professor of History at Yale University, historians do not create memory. Memory exists in many cases alongside history, even coming before history is ever written. The history of Fort Dearborn, and to a greater extent Chicago, is very much illustrative of this fact. The varied life of another monument, entitled the Fort Dearborn Massacre, placed at various locations around this city and now removed from public view altogether, represents how engagement with and understanding of these events have shifted over time. Similarly, the relief which adorns one of the pylons of the Michigan Avenue Bridge, right at the location where Fort Dearborn once stood, depicting Captain William Wells engaged in bloody combat with a rather fanciful headdress-wearing Indian, almost unwittingly tells us a story of a process of myth-making and a process of influencing public memory. And this is really the key point today. It is when history and memory collide, when they mix together, and in certain instances, when they become indistinguishable. That is when we face, I think, the most difficult questions, and often the contested questions about our respective histories and about how to commemorate those histories. In the opinion of Professor Winter, sites of public history, museums, memorials, monuments are, he says, the cathedrals of the 21st century. Notably, they are testaments to the history, however, of families and communities as much as they are to the history of states or great nations. Places where questions almost sacred questions are poised, and sometimes where even such questions can be answered. Those questions, I think, concern the fundamentals of human existence: sacrifice, loyalty, betrayal, friendship, devotion, and death. That is the story of Fort Dearborn. There has been, almost from the moment of its occurrence though, a debate which has raged concerned with what happened at Fort Dearborn in August 1812. And maybe more significantly, how those happenings and those events should be remembered. It is a debate that often focuses, I think, on issues of semantics and the meanings of words. A debate that propagates a competing narrative of events and propagates a history that is very much divisive. Yet today, and I think this is again thanks to Terry's initiative, we have the opportunity to develop a more sophisticated, worldly view of those events, influenced in changes of perspective and awareness. But of those events 200 years ago, we can indeed say much, and some of the facts are most certainly established. I think Kyle's remarks are very much testament to this. On the 15th of August 1812, during the War of 1812, a war which was fought predominantly between the United States and Great Britain, and sometimes maybe mistakenly referred to as the Second War of Independence, a column of over 100 people proceeded, as Kyle has mentioned, to evacuate Fort Dearborn, right on the shores of Lake Michigan, following the orders of General William Hull. Hull worried that with the fall of Mackinac in the north to the British in July of that year, Fort Dearborn and her garrison would be isolated and almost impossible to supply. Ordered with regret, as he stated in his original dispatch, the evacuation to Fort Wayne, Indiana. Amongst this procession were US soldiers and militia under the direction of Captain Nathan Heald, the commandant of Fort Dearborn since his arrival there in 1810. A vanguard of Miami warriors under the direction of Captain William Wells, and 9 women and 18 children, which included Heald's own wife Rebecca and Margaret Helm, wife of Leanne Helm, the fort's second lieutenant. At about 1 to 2 miles from the fort, they came under attack from a Native American war party. Yet accompanying the group was John Kinsey, a trader who lived at Chicago with his family and is seen as one of the first permanent European settlers to establish himself there at the turn of the 19th century. But as I say, between 1 and 2 miles south of Fort Dearborn, where 16th Street and Indiana Avenue now meet, a point where we were just cruising a moment ago, the column proceeded, in Heald's own words, through a corridor that had the sandy beach of Lake Michigan to the left and a high sand dune on their right. It was here, I think, in this most likely of spots, that they were attacked by at least 500 Native American warriors, mainly Potawatomi, but others as well. And what followed, like so many encounters of its kind in the late 18th and early 19th century, was a bloody and vicious battle with casualties on both sides. After the initial exchange of fire, Heald led a charge into the Indian ranks atop the dune, an attempt to retake the high ground. Hand-to-hand fighting ensued with the use of sword, tomahawk, and rifle butt. However, outnumbered and outgunned, the Americans came off much worse. Over half of Heald's group were killed, along with William Wells, his Miami warriors either dead beside him or routed. The women and children, however, were not spared the slaughter. And as Professor Anne Durkin-Keating has pointed out, they were placed too near the valuable supply wagons, bringing up the rear of the column. And with the protection of only a few militiamen, Ensign George Ronan and Surgeon's Mate Isaac Van Voris, many also suffered death or serious injury. Yet some were saved, and not just the women and children, but some of Heald's company as well, thanks to the brave efforts of John Kinsey and the Potawatomi chief Black Partridge. The fight was all over in less than an hour. Heald surrendered to the Native American leader Blackbird, his remaining force taken captive, his supplies claimed as spoils of war, and Fort Dearborn was burned. Most of the contemporary accounts of these events come understandably from white Americans, many of whom had a personal stake in or a personal attachment to what happened at that fateful day in August 1812. We have only one or two Native American accounts, mainly recorded some years after the actual event. To those who did and still do consider this a massacre, it was an inexcusable ambush on a retreating force. Within 2 months, the Detroit judge Augustus B. Woodward penned a letter on the 7th of October 1812 to Colonel Henry Proctor, a British commander in Upper Canada, describing how the garrison at Fort Dearborn had, as he put it, been barbarously and inhumanely massacred. To those who saw this and still do see this as a battle, it was a crushing Native American victory over a legitimate military convoy in a time of war. Writing in 1833, the great war chief Black Hawk told of how he arrived at the Native American camp at Chicago in August 1812, after his counterparts, as he puts it, defeated the American soldiers in battle. In speaking of a supposed agreement to hand over weapons and ammunition, he said if they, the Americans, had fulfilled their word to the Indians, I think they would have gone safe. Similarly, the Potawatomi Simon Pokagon, conversing in the late 1890s, spoke of a different version of events than that recorded by Juliet Kinsey and her counterparts. A version that his father had told him, a version that his father, who had been present at Chicago, in fact, in August 1812, had told him many times, and a story that he says was unchanged each time in the telling. He said he read many stories of the fight at Chicago, and they all speak of the devilry and treachery of the Indians. I am writing a book that will tell of the treachery of the white man. Poignantly, Pokagon suggested, when whites are killed, it is a massacre, but when Indians are killed, it is a fight. Simon Pokagon never did write his book, but his was just one of the many, and I think you'll be surprised at how many accounts and versions of these events that have been presented to us over the course of the last 200 years. These stories, and in some cases pseudo-histories, have fashioned and shaped the memory of Fort Dearborn, and specifically those events of August 1812. Yet again, as I've mentioned, I think we have the opportunity today to rethink those events, to form a new narrative free from the distortions of the past, which renders the competing memory of these events often treacherous and potentially, I think, disfiguring. This new narrative should should seek not to favour one side or another, or to propagate division. Instead of looking for those divisive elements in the story, we must seek a common ground and accept that these were the shared experiences of past inhabitants of this city and of this place. We must also place those events in the wider context of American history, the whole sweep from settlement and colonisation, through revolution and independence, from civil war and civil rights and world war to more modern times. They cannot simply be seen as a vacuum or in a vacuum or as isolated incidents. I think to do so would be almost self-defeating, and to examine those events out of the context of a land divided by war and imperial rivalries would be most particular folly. In doing this, I think we can create a different cultural memory for Chicago, different to what has existed before, yet I would argue in many ways a truer and more valuable memory. And again, to quote Professor Jay Winter, we can no longer have closed societies with frozen pasts, but we can, through discussion and discourse, and an acceptance that whichever way we choose to frame these events, to debate issues of semantics, a debate that I would agree can be very divisive and indeed a very powerful debate, we are nonetheless dealing with a shared history and a shared past. In terms of the events at Fort Dearborn in August 1812, it is a history that is in many ways contested and disputed, but it is nonetheless the inescapable history and the inescapable cultural heritage of this great city. Now, at a distance of over 200 years, it is important for us to re-examine and reiterate that crucial influence of this conflict and the history of Fort Dearborn in shaping and defining this great continent and this great city, respectively. Professor Tim Breen, who is a leading scholar and the director of the Centre for Historical Studies at Northwestern University, our neighbours to the north in Evanston, has spoken about restoring the history of the American Revolution to the American people. Professor Breen's work is exceptional in this regard, but I think we can apply his methodology in restoring the memory of Chicago's past, and more specifically, the history of Fort Dearborn, to all those who have a stake in this city and its history at this key moment during its bicentenary. Over the course of our voyage, I think we might in some small way contribute to this process. And as we travel along Lake Michigan at this time of day, we probably have the best chance we might ever get in this modern, teeming city to in some way understand the solitary and wild nature of Chicago in 1812. That Chicago was not yet the white city of the late 19th century. Not yet the great beating industrial heart of the Midwest. At Fort Dearborn, I think right on the cusp of the American frontier, American dominion was not yet guaranteed. While we can imagine Fort Dearborn standing alone at the mouth of the Chicago River on the banks of Lake Michigan, the star-spangled banner fluttering in a light morning breeze atop its blockhouse, we must also try to envision that this was an area, to use Professor Durkin Keating's terminology, in Indian country. And it was a harsh and severe environment for all those who lived there. But it was also a place of complex relationships, inhabited by a diverse and multicultural community. And maybe I'll say that again. A place of complex relationships, inhabited by a diverse and multicultural community. Dare it be said, in this context at least, that not much has changed for the city of Chicago over the last 200 years. Yet, 200 years ago, this country found itself at war with Great Britain for the second time in a generation. The War of 1812, which rather confusingly lasted until 1815, and to which the events at Fort Dearborn are inextricably linked, had, in the words of former President Thomas Jefferson, writing in 1816 to the British financier Sir John Sinclair, after the peace had been signed, reached the bosom of every man, woman and child in the United States. The beginnings of the war have been seen by many commentators and many historians as a whole hodgepodge of miscommunication with the British, political chess-beating and peacockery in Congress, and the competing and diverging attitudes of war and to war amongst the American population. As the story goes, in fact, upon hearing of President James Madison's declaration of war on Great Britain, one of Madison's Federalist political opponents sent his wife to call upon the First Lady, Dolly Madison, at her sister's home. Entering the house, the young woman let out her long and flowing hair, something of an impropriety in 19th century high society. But to add insult to injury, she then turned to the First Lady and asked if she might find a scissors so that she could cut off her hair and use it to make a rope with which to hang the president. With respect to James Madison, he acted in accordance with the wishes of his Republican war hawk supporters in Congress. Men led by the likes of Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, who believed that a quick and aggressive preemptive strike, specifically an invasion of Canada, would result in a quick American victory. Previously, tensions with the British had been building for a considerable period, with a number of factors contributing to calls for American reprisal. The impressment and drafting of American sailors into the Royal Navy, the seizing of American ships and trade goods that the British felt were bound for Napoleon's France. And specifically, in June 1807, the Royal Navy ship HMS Leopard fired upon the American man-of-war Chesapeake as she sailed from Norfolk, Virginia, under a flag of neutrality. The British captain, Salisbury Price Humphreys, believing that the American warship was harbouring British deserters, boarded the stricken vessel and seized 4 men, 3 of whom claimed American citizenship. All of this added to the great wave of patriotic fervour that engulfed certain sections in both American public and political society, and which caused Thomas Jefferson to state, "Never since the battles at Lexington have I seen the country in such a state of exasperation as at present." Added to this, I think, was the rather, in ways, accurate perception that British influence crossing the Great Lakes from Canada was stirring up Native American animosity against the United States. And I think this is a very important point in the scope of today's discussion, particularly when we've talked about what happened at Fort Dearborn in August 1812. In a moment when the United States was caught up in a war with the great imperial power that was the British Empire, many within the various Native American tribes felt that this was an opportunity to make a stand against Euro-American encroachment on their lands, particularly in this area around the Great Lakes, an area that historian Andrew Caton has called the cockpit of the continent in the early 19th century. Blackbird, a man who would play a central role in the attack at Fort Dearborn in August 1812, saw the Americans as invaders and conquerors. They were, for him, the white devil with his mouth open wide, ready to eat up Potawatomi and other Indian lands in the old Northwest. If allying with the British in war was a way to stop this encroachment, then many believed it was a justifiable step to take on the part of the Native American tribes. Such a viewpoint is, of course, not at all unique in history and should come as no way as a surprise to us in 2012. Irish history again throws up many similar instances, most notably during the First World War, when Britain had her hands full with a war in Europe. A small band of Irish revolutionaries, although many contemporaries would have called them rebels, sought to cast off the imperial yoke during Easter week of 1916 and attempted a rising that would end British dominance in that country. They were, of course, unsuccessful in this instance, but Britain's difficulty was Ireland's opportunity. In a converse sort of way, then, this was exactly the attitude adopted by some Native Americans towards the United States with the outbreak of war in 1812. Andrew Jackson, a man whose personal national celebrity would skyrocket following the War of 1812, and a man who would be named the hero of New Orleans following his remarkable victory over a well-trained force of British veterans in 1815. Actually, Jackson managed to defeat this force of British soldiers 2 weeks after the peace had been officially signed between the United States and the Great British government. But he spoke in 1812 of this declaration of war in a letter that talked about the neutral rights of the United States, the evils of British impressment, national vindication, a desire, most certainly, for territorial conquest and expansion, but most crucially, Jackson spoke of Indian pacification. He compressed all of these issues into 2 neat phrases. The United States went to war, he wrote, to seek some indemnity for past injuries and some security against future aggression. Whether that aggression came from the British or the Native American tribes did not really matter too much to Andrew Jackson. Now, for many then, but certainly not all Americans, the War of 1812 was a monumental moment in the growth of the nation. Jefferson, again writing in 1816, believed that while the British saw the war really as only a minor scuffle on the fringes of empire, a sideshow to the more pressing matter and the concerns of Napoleon Bonaparte, French dominance of Europe, and a vague but possible threat of invasion of England itself. For the American people, the war had reverberated across the fledgling nation, from the eastern seaboard to the midwestern frontier. Of the country, Jefferson said, "The maritime parts have felt it in the conflagration of their houses and towns, and the desolation of their farms. the borderers in the massacres and scalping of their husbands, wives, and children, and in the middle parts, in their personal labours and loss in defence of both frontiers, and the revolting scenes they have witnessed. Strong, emotive words. But at that small remove in 1816, Jefferson set out his perception of the War of 1812, and began also, in that instance, in creating an enduring legacy. A legacy to which the events at Fort Dearborn, about which we've already spoke, are coupled. For the American people, as British historian Jeremy Black noted, the image of war in 1812 was all flames and water. But it was a war that he says was crucial to defining the destiny of North America. It is into this context, I think, that we have to set the history of Chicago, and more importantly, the story of Fort Dearborn. Yet, since Jefferson's stirring assessment in 1816, the War of 1812 has fallen by the wayside in the collective memory. Neither as glorious nor as important as the War of Independence, nor as enduring as the Civil War, 1812, if you will, lacks maybe the panache of other conflicts in American history. In contrast to this, University of California history professor Alan Taylor, and Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, has stated that in Canada, the war was essential in forming a sense of Canadian nationalism and national identity. This was, he says, in many ways a civil war for the North American continent, in which Americans, British Canadians, and even, he says, Irish immigrants, and of course Native Americans, who were stuck right in the middle, found themselves embroiled. It was, in Taylor's view, a war that transformed the continent, creating a lasting boundary between the king's subjects and the republic's citizens. Thus, I think Chicago was not, in 1812, an uninhabited space. It was not the great open plain or vast prairie, as endorsed later by men like John O'Sullivan, when he coined the term manifest destiny in the late 19th century. O'Sullivan was the descendant of a long line of Irish adventurers, and would write of America's destiny to overspread the continent allotted by Providence for the free development of our yearly multiplying millions. His grand narrative, however, made small beer of the multifaceted, complicated, and often meaningful relationships that had been built up between US citizens and Native Americans, between friends and sometimes enemies, between families and trading partners, between cultures and civilizations. In his pioneering work entitled The Middle Ground, Richard White, professor of history at Stanford, spoke of this complex web of social interaction and the evolving and almost constantly shifting nature of the relationships between Native Americans and Euro-American settlers. This was a middle ground, White says, that existed geographically around the Great Lakes, but it was also a place existing between peoples and cultures. White speaks of the development of, at first, a mutually comprehensible world that would ultimately fall away and result in the breakdown of accommodation and common meanings by the early 19th century. The breakdown, in many respects, of White's middle ground. At its most very basic level, then, the story of Fort Dearborn in August 1812 is twofold. On the one hand, it is a story of a clash of identities and two competing civilizations. One civilization that wished to see its lands retained and renewed by the removal of an invading foe. This other civilization, however, was embodied by a new nation, a pioneering people, attempting to carve out a place in the world in both a domestic and international context. Yet there is, I think, another side to this history, and one which I feel is much more important. It is certainly a story that saw the falling away of this middle ground. But it was first and foremost a story of people, caught up in the general concerns of life, dealing with extraordinary events, and I think for certain individuals, becoming extraordinary in themselves. There are many names of those who were the soldiers, warriors, and witnesses of those events at Fort Dearborn, and those names have come down to us over the past 200 years. Within the fort itself, we know of men like Captain Nathan Heald, who I've mentioned already, commander of the outpost at Chicago. On the 23rd of May 1811, Heald had married his wife Rebecca Wells, daughter of General Samuel Wells and niece of William Wells, of whom I'll say more in a moment, and returned to Fort Dearborn with Rebecca the following month, arriving in June of 1811, a full year or more before that fateful day in August 1812. Of Heald, in fact, we know quite a bit. Born on the 24th of September in that most fateful of years, 1775. He joined the US Army in 1799 as an ensign. He was a career soldier, holding commands of various garrisons and forts along the frontier as early as 1805. And in fact, he took command of Fort Wayne in Indiana in January 1807. Quite an important posting for a young officer of 32. Heald was an experienced soldier and commander by the time he arrived at Chicago. But his name has been blacklisted in history, and he is often portrayed as a rash and stubborn officer whose decision to march out on the 15th of August 1812 sealed the fate of many Americans on that morning. It would be a mistake, I think, and as historian M.M. Quaife has noted, to simply brush over his experience in command on the frontier. But what might be even more telling is that Heald suffered his own personal tragedy in May of 1812, when his infant son was stillborn, the reason for which Heald himself recorded in his journal was only for want of a skillful midwife. Therefore, I think Fort Dearborn certainly held ghosts for Nathan Heald and his wife Rebecca. It is certainly plausible that Heald wished to leave that place at the first possible opportunity. The order to evacuate, which he received on the 9th of August 1812 from General William Hull, gave him just such a reason. It was an order he intended to follow while still grieving the loss of his child, which happened just 3 months before. Whether or not Heald's own personal circumstances clouded his judgment in the days or weeks that led up to the fall of Fort Dearborn, his story, I think, is evidence of the very real and oft-times tragic experiences of those people that lived in this harsh environment, and that those people who lived their lives in and around Fort Dearborn in August 1812. Similarly, other officers such as Leonie Helm and Ensign George Ronan held positions of rank at Fort Dearborn. The former Helm survived the battle and would later go on to contribute another published account, this one here in fact, of those events in August 1812. An account that would add more fuel to the fire in the massacre narrative. Helm's account was in fact the basis for the imagery of the Fort Dearborn monument, which is, as I say, now hidden in a warehouse out of public view. Helm was in fact the son-in-law of John Kinsey, being married to Kinsey's stepdaughter Margaret, who was also present at Fort Dearborn. In Helm's story, Nathan Heald is vilified, and Helm felt he was unable to publish his history until Heald had in fact retired from the service, at this stage a major in the US Army. Helm, writing in 1814, stated, "I have waited a long time, expecting a court of inquiry on his conduct, but see plainly that is to be overlooked. I am resolved now to do myself justice, and even if I have to leave the service to publish this history, I will do so." Ensign George Ronan, however, did not escape the fighting on the 15th of August with his life. Killed while bravely defending the convoy, he was a graduate of West Point and holds the rather melancholy distinction of being the first graduate to be killed in combat with an enemy force. Residing with their husbands then were Margaret Helm and Rebecca Heald, the former saved by Black Partridge at the height of the battle, the latter grievously wounded in the fighting, but eventually reunited with her husband and surviving to raise a family. And of course, there was John Kinsey, a man whose family and descendants have made a lasting impression on the history of Fort Dearborn. Kinsey, an established trader, had many friends among both the Native Americans and the garrison at Fort Dearborn. He hoped that his position of repute and his standing with both parties could help in quelling any discontent in the lead up to the fort's evacuation in August 1812. Yet we also know of those who existed outside of Fort Dearborn, beyond the wooden palisade. And again, I must point to the work of Professor Anne Durkin-Keating in this regard. She has given us the first, I think, detailed account of those tribes and individuals who were specifically present at Chicago in August 1812. As Nathan Heald himself noted in his journal, there was as many as 1,000 Native Americans in the vicinity of Fort Dearborn leading up to the evacuation on the 15th of August. Certainly a vast number of warriors, probably about 500, but also families, women and children. This was no war party in the singular sense of the word. But again, just like those inside Fort Dearborn, it was a collection of people simply trying to survive in an unforgiving environment. Many gathered at Chicago in the hope that they would find supplies to help overcome the approaching winter season. Among the multitudes were the notable leaders, and I use anglicised forms of the names here where applicable, Blackbird, Mad Sturgeon, his brothers White Sturgeon and Clear Day, and the Potawatomi, Nunungi and Toppanby. Some did gather, I think, in anticipation of a possible battle. In response to the call to war of Tecumseh, the Shawnee prophet, and particularly in this instance, Mainpoc, who had been raising troops and attacking US positions, often in collaboration with the British, for some time previous. Yet, just like among American citizens, there was no uniform Indian response to such a call to arms, to fight with the British or the United States, in fact to go to war at all, either across the continent or here at Chicago. What all of these people gathered in this area had in common, however, in the days and weeks that led up to the fall of Fort Dearborn, was that they had a stake in the future of Chicago. Many had been neighbours, trading partners, and some even friends, aware of each other's existence and in some respects bound to the relationships that they had built. It is most fitting then, I think, that we commemorate, remember, analyse, whatever word you wish to use, these events in the days leading up to August 1815, as opposed to August 15th itself. Just as in 1812 then, 200 years ago, this history is not the history of one day, it is not the story of just 1 hour, but rather something much more substantial, much more intricate than that. We speak of people who did not appear at one specific location, on one specific day, at one specific time, but of people who had lives that transcended the events at Fort Dearborn in August 1812. And I think that is what we commemorate today, more than anything else. Two figures who stand out for me in the history of Fort Dearborn, and are very much representative of this fact, are Chief Black Partridge and Captain William Wells. Their names are now synonymous with the story and history of Fort Dearborn, but their experiences of those events were very, very different. Certainly, Black Partridge has been immortalised thanks to the Fort Dearborn Massacre Monument, which in a rather stylised manner, depicts the moment when he interceded to save the life of Margaret Helm, at the height of the battle. Similarly, William Wells is rightly remembered for his selfless bravery, firstly in arriving at Chicago to help with the evacuation, due very much to the fact that his niece Rebecca was in residence there, and secondly for his actions during the battle itself, when he fought bravely to defend the column. But it was their actions in the days preceding the 15th of August, I would argue, for which they should be remembered. They are two men who in many cases existed in the middle ground and lived their lives in and around and a part of Indian country. They, like many of their contemporaries, had a real stake in Chicago as a geographical, but also maybe as a metaphysical area. Chicago in 1812 then acted as a meeting point for two men who lived their lives right on the frontier of their respective civilizations. And for a long time, figures like Wells and Black Partridge bridged the gap that existed between white and Native Americans. They came to Chicago in August 1812, however, by very different routes. As a child, William Wells had in fact been captured and subsequently adopted by Miami Indians. When he was between 12 and 14 years old, in and around 1784, possibly following the death of his own natural parents in the early 1770s. He spent his teenage years amongst the Miami, very much growing accustomed to his new life and accepting his new identity. We actually have no record of any attempt by Wells to ever escape his newfound existence. We can be almost certain, however, that by 1789, Wells's brothers by birth, Samuel and Carty, had made contact with their sibling, but Wells decided to stay with the Miami. He was married and had a son himself by 1791, while at the same time rekindling his relationship with his white family. But Wells again remained loyal to the Miami, and after his wife, child, and adopted mother were captured and presumed dead in raids led by the US Army during the Northwest Indian War, Wells came to the attention of the great Miami war chief, Little Turtle. And he played an important role in the respective Indian victories over Generals Haymar and St. Clair. So much so that Little Turtle married his daughter Sweetbreeze to Wells, ensuring both a lasting formal but also a personal tie between the two for the remainder of their days. Wells did, if you like, return to his white heritage with Little Turtle's blessing and joined the US Army, working as a US Indian agent at Fort Wayne. Wells understood then, maybe better than most, in fact, maybe better than anyone, the fragile relationship between Native Americans and white Americans in the early 19th century. And he attempted to control US policy as best he could, at times going against the orders of his superiors. On the 22nd of January 1812, or July 1812, in possibly his last letter to William Henry Harrison, then the governor of the Indiana Territory, Wells wrote of the deteriorating situation in the Northwest, stating that Tecumseh hoped to raise the Western Indians against the United States, and as he said, strike a heavy blow against the whites. Through his long and profound and almost unique knowledge of the middle ground and the shifting relationships in the old Northwest, Wells embarked on his journey to Fort Dearborn in 1812 at the head of his Miami warriors, aware of the volatile and dangerous area into which he rode. Yet it was through a sense of duty and maybe more importantly, familial ties that made him present himself on the 13th of August to Nathan Heald in an attempt to help with that evacuation at Fort Dearborn. On the 15th, Wells blackened his face in the style of a Miami warrior prepared for battle. Yet it was also how Miami warriors decked themselves in preparation for death. Complementing Wells then, Black Partridge, a Potawatomi chief from a village along the Illinois River, arrived at Fort Dearborn on the 14th of August with a stark warning. Black Partridge grew up in southwest Michigan, around the St. Joseph River, and while he had fought against the Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers, he had nonetheless been a staunch ally of the United States since the 1795 Treaty of Greenville, where he was gifted with a medal to wear around his neck to signify his standing and newfound hope for peace and cooperation with the Americans. We have, in fact, no contemporary accounts of Black Partridge's specific role at Greenville, or the moment when he received this token of friendship. But rather, I think ironically, we have an account from Black Hawk in 1893, noting his meeting with a British colonel during the War of 1812. In an attempt to win the war chief to the British cause, the British went about much the same ritual. And we can, I think, surmise that these events were very similar to those which Black Partridge experienced in his interaction with the Americans at Greenville in 1795. Black Hawk writes, "He then placed a medal around my neck and gave me a piece of paper, which I lost in the late war, and a silk flag, and said, 'General Black Hawk, you are to command all the braves that leave here the day after tomorrow.' I was pleased," says Black Hawk, "because this was a speech spoken by a brave." There was quite, I think...
Well Street Bridge.
Yes. Like most appropriate time, I think, yeah, to see. We've just passed Dearborn Street and also Wells Street Bridge, so we'll wait for the train to pass. Good time, yes, most certainly. There was, however, quite a tradition amongst European and subsequently US officials of awarding these type of medals or tokens of friendship to Native Americans in recognition of their status and camaraderie. For many, such an emblem was a great endorsement and often depicted an image of the current US president sitting at Washington. Yet it was on the 14th of August 1812 that Black Partridge returned this medal to Nathan Heald. Arriving at Fort Dearborn late that night, he requested a meeting with the fort's commander. We have, I think, a number of competing descriptions of this event, but present were possibly Nathan Heald, William Wells, an interpreter, and maybe even John Kinsey. Leanne Helm and Juliet Kinsey give us a somewhat fanciful account of Black Partridge's speech that night, but it is nonetheless, at least I think, an indication of the warning that the Potawatomi had to bestow. Evidently, speaking through the interpreter, he stated that linden birds had been singing in his ears, and that the garrison needed to be extremely wary on the march they planned for the morrow. At this juncture, Black Partridge removed his medal, laying it before the US captain. "I come to deliver up to you the medal I wear. It was given to me by the Americans, and I have long worn it as a token of our mutual friendship. But our young men are resolved to imbue their hands in the blood of the whites. I cannot restrain them, and I will not wear a token of peace while I am compelled to act as an enemy." In an attempt to at least lessen the catastrophe which we know now was to follow the next day, Black Partridge tried in vain to warn his longtime acquaintances, men and women he knew personally, about the dangers they faced the following morning. In doing so, he went against the designs of many in his own tribe, and at the height of the conflicts the next day, he interceded directly to save Margaret Helm, and claimed many of the surviving Americans as his personal prisoners in order to protect them in the aftermath of the battle. As Professor Durkin Keating stresses, this was then a battle in which personal loyalties mattered. People acted as neighbours and friends as well as enemies in war. Black Partridge and William Wells deservedly share a revered place in the pantheon of Chicago's greatest residents. They are interesting for so many reasons, not least because they embody the difficulties of existing and surviving in the Chicago of 1812. But also because they came from opposite sides of a divide. It was, however, a divide that they themselves placed little stock in. And when events overhauled them, they tried, ultimately unsuccessfully, but nonetheless valiantly, to bridge that gap and hold together what had become their middle ground. Within the general, often seemingly, I think, clear-cut version of US history, the history of Chicago in 1812 is much more complex. It was determined often by the small but important relationships between peoples and communities, relationships that are sometimes not considered historically significant. Yet, they were what shaped the lives of those people at Chicago in 1812 in a much more meaningful way than any national policy. Is this not exactly the case for many of us today? To conclude then, in May of 2011, the Irish people welcomed to their shores two significant heads of state. First, President Barack Obama continued the long and happy tradition of American presidents visiting the country. speaking to an audience of thousands in Dublin in the shadow of Trinity College and the old Houses of Parliament. He spoke with the words Is Féidir Linn, which is Irish for yes we can, of the age-old links of friendship and mutual respect that existed between the two nations. However, following the President's visit, Ireland extended the hand of friendship once more, and for the first time since the foundation of the independent republic, a British monarch, Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, set foot on Irish soil. This was a monumental moment in the history of the Irish state, but also in the history of British and Irish relations. While not welcomed by all elements in Irish society, it signified that a new perspective had been reached. Speaking at a dinner hosted by the President of Ireland, Mary McAleese, in Dublin Castle, which was formerly the seat of British power and authority in Ireland, Queen Elizabeth delivered a speech that captured the room. She said, "With the benefit of historical hindsight, we can all see things that we wish had been done differently or not at all. But what were once only hopes for the future have now come to pass." I think this too is a special moment. It is a moment when Chicago as a city can move beyond the narratives of violence and victimhood that penetrate the memory of Fort Dearborn in August 1812. We must move towards an open and shared history of these events within the wider context of American history. It is through events like this, inspired by Terry and the work of others who I've mentioned already, that make possible such a discourse. When Ivan Mestrovic placed his great sculptures in Grant Park, he put no weapons in the hands of his Indians, in the hands of his bowmen or spearmen. In his efforts to memorialize events in American history, he granted the public the gift of imagination and asked them for them to decide how his memorials should be completed. We have, I think, a chance now to build a new narrative of the history of Fort Dearborn and to extend that gift even further. But we should not expect one simple answer. This issue and this history is much too complex. Yet we need to tell this story and to share this history. But it is a story that has not just two sides, but many sides. And most importantly, it is a story of people and their struggles, their families, their victories and defeats, their lives, loves and losses. At this moment, at the bicentenary of the Fort Dearborn conflict, I think that is the story that this great city of Chicago can tell. That is the history that this bustling, indomitable metropolis can represent. And I think it is a story and a history that Chicago and all her people can be very much proud to bear. Thank you very much. Well, we're coming now, I think, to the intersection that I referenced earlier about Wacker Drive, the raised intersection now, of course, because the city has changed, the landscape has changed to a great degree. But obviously, any of you who are aware with this area, you have the Fort Dearborn plaques embedded in the ground to show the area of where Fort Dearborn once stood. But we can see, I think, even today, the key and the prominent position that this place would have had right on the mouth of the Chicago River, right beside Lake Michigan. And that was key in 1812 because with Hull's order on the 9th of August that Heald received, he was very much afraid that with the fall of Mackinac, which was a strong American position in 1812, that this fort would become isolated. And it's so hard, I think, for us to imagine when we look around. And I went on a great tour yesterday morning with Ed Mauser, and he spoke about all of these great and fantastic buildings here on the ChicagoLineCruises. But it's so hard for us to even try and get a visual of what that must have been like for these people, right on the cusp of the American frontier. And I think what we see now, and I think it is right, that there is some kind of commemoration to those people who lived their lives here. And when we stand just here at this intersection of Wacker Drive and Michigan Avenue, we are standing at the place where these people existed. this was their life. Those 4 walls or 5 walls of Fort Dearborn, that wooden palisade, was in a sense their own piece of the United States. And outside, beyond that, as I've talked about, was a place that they weren't really too sure about. It was a place, I think, that was a difficult place and a harsh environment in which to survive. But with the fall of Mackinac to the British in the north, and in fact, Mackinac was taken by a very small British fort. The British garrison nearby had heard before the American garrison at Mackinac that war had been declared. They quickly took their one cannon, dragged it to the top of a nearby hill, fired one shot across the top of the fort, and proceeded to take the American surrender. The small garrison at Mackinac really had no clue what was happening, why their usual friends in Canada were now firing a cannon at them. But it was just like that, I think. Mackinac is a good story and a good case study in talking about the rather difficult way in which people had to live their lives right on this frontier. It was not something like with today. We didn't have instantaneous communication, and things that happened on the frontier were not decided by the president in Washington or the administration in Washington. They were not decided even by the people in the great cities that lived that existed close, indeed, to the frontier. But they were decided, and those relationships that were built up between the people that lived there. And I think as we pass this area and we pass the site of Fort Dearborn, it is really poignant for us to remember that it was those small and special relationships between people that defined the history, I think, of this city and of those people in 1812. Obviously, this comes down to the idea of, do we call this a massacre or do we call this a battle? What I tried to do today is to set this in the context of a much wider history. In 1812, the war between Britain and the United States was, in a sense, important for the Native American tribes. They saw this as an opportunity to remove American incursion into Indian territory. The British had a much, let's say, better relationship with many of the Native American tribes following the Revolution. And when they kind of removed themselves to Canada, many of the Native American tribes felt that the British were, in fact, more friendly than the Americans that they had, in many respects, on their doorstep. We think that there was an agreement given to some of the Potawatomi that they would receive all of the ammunition, the supplies, and indeed the liquor that was housed in the fort and at John Kinsey's station just beyond Fort Dearborn's walls. Heald decided, and we do think that Heald decided, and he writes this in his own official report, that to hand over the ammunition and the liquor was probably a bad idea. We can understand that, I think, in a time of war, to hand over, obviously, ammunition, first of all, to a party of people who might in turn become enemies, was difficult. I think trying to find, though, one moment, a point, or that kind of a spark that set the Indian attack, I think, is not the way to look at this. I don't think we need to think of this as well, they didn't get the liquor and they didn't get the guns, so they attacked the 100 Americans who were evacuated. I think this is part of a much wider conflict. And many, as I said, had answered a call to war that Tecumseh obviously had sent out across the Indian nation. And Mainpok, particularly here in Chicago, had sent what we call a war belt to many of the Indians who were camped outside Fort Dearborn in August 1812. And I think this was probably an event that was building. Some historians have put it down to this regain on a promise to some of the Potawatomi. But we do have competing events, and I think it's important to say that the rest of the supplies were distributed to the local tribes. Everything else that was at the fort was distributed to the people who were there. But to kind of focus on one point to say that that's why Native Americans attacked a retreating US convoy, I think is maybe a little bit too simplistic. But we can see it as a prominent moment, most certainly, I think. Well, I think, again, we focus on this idea of a massacre when we talk about Fort Dearborn all the time. And for so long, that's been the terminology that we use. Professor Anne Durkin-Keating does talk about this quite a bit in her new book. And she says that women and children represented for many Native Americans, I think, the first wave of invaders. They were, in many respects, going to be the future generations of the people who would hold on to Indian lands in Indian territory. But I don't think that we should focus on this idea of a massacre. The fact that women and children were killed is regrettable, but it's not unique in history. It's not the only time something like this happens in history. And I think to focus on that one point takes away from, I think, the more complex issues. This was a battle. It was a bloody engagement. It was a vicious engagement. We can't make excuses for anyone who would attack women and children, whether it was United States soldiers, whether it was Native Americans, specifically at Chicago in August 1812. But to focus on the idea that this is only a massacre, that this happens at this time, and it is a decision decided in that 1 hour, in that moment, to massacre everyone who walks out of Fort Dearborn, I think is the wrong way to think about this. And that's what I tried to flesh out today. Certainly, the British were stirring up animosity between the United States and their Native American neighbours, most definitely. We have lots of instances of that communications being, as I say, sent across the Great Lakes to try and find, I suppose, an ally in war against the United States. And this is one of the reasons why Madison feels he needs to declare war in 1812. He says we can't have the British interfering in American policy anymore. And the fact that they are stirring up Native American animosity against US positions all across the frontier is something that Madison, and particularly later Andrew Jackson, finds to be completely unacceptable. At Chicago, certainly we don't have any accounts of British soldiers being involved, and we don't have any accounts of the British sending communications particularly to maybe someone like Blackbird. This was a Native American attack, most certainly, but it was in the context of, as I say, a land that was at war, a continent that was at war. And I think it comes back again to what you were saying about how do we consider this? Do we consider this a massacre, or what do we consider it a battle? It is still a difficult question. I think one that hasn't been decided yet. But certainly, I think all of this plays into the bigger picture, this idea that the British had an influence, that this was a moment for Native Americans to push back an invading foe. This was, in a sense, for the Americans at Fort Dearborn in an inexcusable attack on a force that decided to retreat and to pull out of what we might call Indian country. So I think it's all part of one much bigger picture that I think is very, very important when we consider a topic like this. Okay, well, if I could just say before I hand back to Terry, thank you all very much for being here this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity. I really appreciate your attention and taking the time to listen to my ramblings at the best of times. And again, I want to extend a really great thanks to Terry Johnson, who certainly put all of this together, and without him, I certainly wouldn't have been here today, and I doubt many of you would either. But thank you again, and I hope you have a great day. Okay, thank you very much.